They made fun of it from the moment it arrived in camp. A thin barrel, a short stock, and a weight so light that a child could swing it without effort. Soldiers hooted, jeered, and branded it the pea shooter, convinced that no serious army would ever trust something that tiny on a real battlefield. But fate has a way of hiding strength in the smallest places, and on one bitter morning in Europe, a little gun proved what steel, powder, and courage could truly do. The day began long before sunrise, beneath a sky so dark it swallowed the stars. A platoon of Allied infantry huddled inside shallow trenches carved into the frozen earth. Their uniforms were soaked from melted snow, their hands cracked and stiff from the cold. Supplies were thin. Food was almost gone. Worst of all, the ammunition crates had run dry faster than command predicted. Private Collins rubbed his arms, trying to push warmth back into his body. His eyes drifted to the slim weapon lying in his lap, his assigned gun, the one everyone mocked when distribution day came. He remembered how heavy riflemen thumped him on the shoulder and laughed. "Good luck with your toy, Collins. Try not to blow bubbles with it." Collins tried to laugh back, but something inside him twisted. This wasn't boot camp anymore. This was a war where every mistake meant a funeral, and he had been handed the lightest weapon on the field. A low whistle cut through the cold air, the sergeant's signal. The men tensed. Enemy patrols had been spotted in the woods the night before. Command warned that a counterattack could come any time. The fog around them felt alive, like it was hiding things just out of sight. Minutes crawled past, thick with anticipation. Then, as the first hints of sunlight bled through the trees, they heard it, the rumble of boots, faint at first, then growing louder. Collins' heart slammed inside his chest. Figures emerged through the mist like ghosts materializing. First 5, then 10, then dozens. Within seconds, the quiet forest exploded with gunfire. The enemy attacked with brutal precision, spraying bullets that hammered into trees, trenches, and dirt. Allied soldiers scrambled to return fire. The trench shook as mortars thumped and burst nearby. Collins pressed himself against the dirt wall, breathing fast as men beside him shouted for more ammo. The heavy machine guns thundered, stitching lines of lead into the fog where shapes flickered. But every second cost them bullets they didn't have. A gunner cursed as his belt snapped empty. Another soldier fumbled for extra clips, but the box beside him was bare. Then the worst sound rose above the battle. A heavy machine gun coughed, sputtered, and jammed. Enemy fire intensified. Shadows crept closer between the shattered trees. The platoon's fire slowed, then staggered. Someone yelled that they were being overrun. Collins felt panic clawing up his throat, a cold fear worse than the winter itself. He clutched his little weapon, still untested in real combat. He remembered the laughter, the jokes, the bets that it would jam first. But now there was no time left to doubt. Collins rose from the trench lip just enough to see. His trigger finger trembled. He exhaled, steadied his aim, and pulled. The shot cracked like a snapping branch. The recoil barely nudged his shoulder. A single bullet sliced through the air and struck the nearest advancing soldier. Collins blinked, unsure if he imagined it, until the man dropped face first into the dirt. Collins fired again. Another enemy fell, clutching his chest. The little gun barked faster, cleaner, smoother than he expected. The cycle of bullets feeding through the chamber felt seamless. No grinding, no jamming. The sergeant looked back and shouted, "Collins, keep that thing going." Collins did more than keep it going. He moved along the trench, popping up and down, firing fast and shifting positions faster than the heavier riflemen could. The lightness he once hated became his greatest advantage. While others needed time to brace themselves, Collins could turn, aim, and shoot with the speed of instinct. In front of him, the enemy charge shuddered. Soldiers darted behind trees and rocks, clearly confused that such fierce firepower was still hammering them despite the Allied guns falling silent. The corporal tossed Collins a spare magazine, lighter, smaller, and easier to handle than standard ones. Collins slammed it into place and kept firing. Shells scattered near his boots. Smoke drifted over the trench. Adrenaline drowned his fear. Behind him, the platoon came back to life. Riflemen found their last rounds. One gunner cleared the jam and roared his mounted weapon back into action. The tide was shifting, not by strength of numbers, but by refusal to break. For every step forward the enemy tried to take, Colin's little gun punched them backward. The fog turned into chaos. The battle surged like a living storm. Collins barely had time to breathe between shots. The men beside him shouted warnings and distances, ducking the hail of bullets that kicked dirt into their eyes. Yet the small gun in his hands kept spitting fire with a rhythm that seemed almost fearless, as if it refused to acknowledge the terror that surrounded them. Every time Collins fired, it felt lighter, faster, more certain. He swept the trench line, tracing targets that tried to slip around the flanks. The enemy, who arrived confident, loud, and overwhelming, found themselves pinned down by a weapon no one thought mattered. Soldiers who had once laughed now stared at Collins in wide-eyed disbelief. The pea shooter wasn't just holding the line. It was stopping a collapse the platoon had already feared was inevitable. Then, through the fog, Collins saw something that froze him. A trio of enemy troops broke from cover and sprinted toward a dip in the ground, a position that would let them flank the trench and unleash fire from the side. If they reached it, the Allied line would fold like wet paper. Collins didn't think. He vaulted to the edge of the trench, dirt spraying as his boots skidded. His sergeant shouted after him, but Collins barely heard it over the pounding in his ears. He steadied his aim, let instinct do the work, and squeezed the trigger in quick bursts. One soldier fell, then another. The third tried to dive, but a final shot caught him before he disappeared behind a stump. Collins dropped back into the trench, heart racing, lungs burning with cold air. The sergeant grabbed his shoulder and gave it a fierce shake, not of anger but pride. "You just saved us," he growled over the noise. The words barely registered before more movement appeared in the tree line. But something was different now. The enemy's advance was slowing. Their formation, sharp at the start, had crumbled into scattered pockets. Collins could feel it, the moment when attackers became survivors. Their fire lost its ferocity. A handful still fired back, but many others stayed low, waiting, unsure if pushing forward meant suicide. When the heavy machine gun finally revived with a thunderous roar, the shift became undeniable. The weapon tore into the forest with loud, punishing bursts, clearing paths and ripping through the last pieces of the enemy's confidence. Riflemen beside Collins lined up their shots and added to the growing wall of force pushing the attackers back. And then it happened, the thing every soldier prays for but never counts on. The enemy broke. One by one, then in clusters, the figures ahead began retreating, dragging wounded comrades, abandoning the gear they carried so proudly only minutes before. Their boots slapped through the mud in a hurried scramble. Their gunfire sputtered, then faded entirely. Soon the woods were quiet except for the crackling of burning branches and the ringing echo of distant retreat. Collins lowered his weapon. He didn't even realize how tight his grip had been until his fingers ached. His whole body trembled, not with fear but with the aftershock of survival. Around him, men leaned against trench walls, sighing, laughing, or simply staring. The sergeant wiped his brow and finally let out a long whistle. "We held," he said softly, as if afraid the forest might hear and disagree. They had held, against a force that nearly tripled their number, against dwindling ammo, frozen hands, and failing weapons. And the line hadn't broken, not because of the big guns, but because one man with a small weapon refused to let it fall. As the sun rose higher, melting frost from the trees, soldiers moved slowly out of the trench to collect enemy weapons, check for wounded, and secure the area. Collins remained still for a moment longer, looking down at the gun in his hands. The gun that wasn't supposed to matter. The gun they joked about. The gun he dreaded being assigned. Now he couldn't imagine being armed with anything else. Later that week, the platoon filed a full report to command. They listed casualties, ammunition use, and confirmed enemy losses. And under the section marked decisive factors, the sergeant wrote one sentence that officers couldn't ignore. Light automatic weapon proved most effective under pressure. Those words traveled faster than anyone expected. Commanders read them. Quartermasters double-checked inventory. Engineers revisited the design they had nearly abandoned. Within a month, more units were quietly supplied with the once-mocked lightweight gun. Soldiers who had scoffed now cleaned it with respect. Some even requested it over heavier rifles, recognizing its ease, speed, and reliability. And Collins? He carried that gun through every patrol that followed, no longer embarrassed but proud. The joke stopped. The name changed. Now they called it what it truly was, a lifesaver. But the lesson outlived the battle, the mission, and even the war. Veterans told it years later, sitting on porches or leaning on canes, speaking to sons and grandsons who couldn't picture a world of trenches and falling shells. They told them how failing equipment shook their hopes, how fear clawed at their resolve, and how sometimes the most powerful force on a battlefield wasn't the biggest gun or the heaviest armor. Sometimes it was belief, sometimes it was instinct, and sometimes it was a light, underestimated weapon in the hands of a soldier who refused to quit. In war, size fools many. Weight misleads most. But impact, real impact, is born in the outcome, not the appearance. They once laughed at a little gun, but history remembers it differently. A weapon that hit harder than anyone expected. A small instrument that changed a battle and the men who survived it. A little gun with a big punch in World War II. Collision, please subscribe my YouTube channel.